Okay, welcome everybody. Hello and welcome to the book launch for Lady in Waiting, the third book in my Tudor Court series. If you're here live, I thank you a little extra, or congratulations on finding a reason to get out of watching the game. I'm not a sports ball person myself, so I'm happy up here. I'm going to waffle on a little bit here just to give people time to check in. I see one person's already here. This is, as I said, the third book in the series, and it's an especially exciting one for me because it's my first as an indie author. For those who don't know what that means, I got my rights back from my publisher late last year, and I republished Songbird and A Wider World myself. This one, Lady in Waiting, was all me, and it's been quite the learning curve. If learning new things keeps your brain young, I think I've given myself a few years back. These books are technically a series, and certainly for sales purposes, I link them that way, but they are also what's known as linked standalones. You can read each book as its own story, and you will have a complete story at the end. But also the characters do pop up into each other's stories because I love them and I can't let them go. I'm going to read a little bit from A Wider World here to start us off, just for the people who haven't read it yet and to give a little bit of context for the main character of Lady in Waiting. Marjorie Preston is 24 when she makes her first appearance in, well, actually she's 4 when she makes her first appearance in A Wider World. And then she is 24 when she and Robin Lewis encounter each other again. Robin is in exile in France. He's been driven out of England because he was a known Protestant who helped close the monasteries in England, and Queen Mary didn't really like that about him. So he fled the country, and he's on his way home, and he stops in to visit the Preston family in France. He has been leasing their house since they had to flee in 1540. So it's a social call, and he's just killing time until he can catch a boat home. And this is Robin's introduction to the grown-up Marjorie Preston. Our horse's hooves struck sparks on the stone flags of the courtyard of the Preston house. Before my boots touched the ground, a child ran up and took the reins. Sebastian dismounted and followed as the horses were led to the stable. The wide front door opened before I could knock. A liveried servant led me to a gracious chamber off the main hall. "Milady will be with you shortly." I waited, admiring the room's appointments, which were luxurious without being lavish. Somehow, despite the difference in architecture and furnishings, it felt like Winterset. I wondered how it came about, the talent for making a home. I had made improvements to the house, but it was not this comfortable. The door swung open, but instead of Lady Margaret, a young woman strode into the room. Taking no notice of me, she peeled off her gloves and flung them onto the table. "Good afternoon." She whirled. "Good afternoon, monsieur." Her eyes narrowed. "I know you." "You do?" I remembered her, the small daughter of the slaughtered Preston son. "You were very young when we met." "You took our house." Her eyes were her grandfather's, sharp and canny. She'd grown into the nose, at least. "I'm not likely to forget." I attempted a smile. "It was an arrangement with your grandfather to keep you all safe." Her mouth curved into a smile as sincere as mine had been charming. "If by safe you mean bored to death." "Good afternoon, Master Lewis." Margaret Preston was in deep mourning, but her round face wore a genial expression. "How wonderful to see you again. Marjorie, Master Lewis is our guest." Brows like slashes of ink rose to her hairline, and has been these many years. "A moment, sir." Lady Margaret marched her granddaughter from the chamber, and I listened to the rise and fall of their voices outside the door. She returned, her hands clasped at her breast. "My daughter is not much in society. Her manners are appalling." I found her refreshing. Like cold water to the face, Lady Margaret said. Please, come through to my parlor. Another pleasing room, this one more feminine, but with comfortable chairs and an inlaid table before the fire. Lady Margaret put aside an unfinished bit of embroidery so our refreshments could be set out. Tell me, how is Winterset? Well, when last I heard, I said, it's under Fowler's care at the moment, as I've been traveling. He reports to you? Most regularly. Lady Margaret sipped her wine. But he doesn't live there, and you do. I miss my house. After 18 years, Winterset felt like my home. I've been very comfortable there. I regret I've had to be away so much these last years. She gazed into her cup. It's time for us to return to England. For me as well. I explained the Queen's failing health and her having, at last, made Princess Elizabeth her heir. But if you plan to return, I'll send word to Fowler to start packing my things. Let us see how it goes, she said. We will not make a quick removal. Stay in the house for as long as you require, and until you are ready to take ship for England, you must be our guest here. It will only be a few days, I said. I have already arranged passage on the Unicorn, leaving from Honfleur on the 6th of November. And this is a bit later in the same day, or on the next day, I'm sorry. I encountered Marjorie Preston in the courtyard the next morning, returning from a visit to the stables. At supper the night before, she had kept her eyes down and spoken only when addressed, still feeling the effects of her grandmother's lecture. She bid me good day, her manner still distant. By her costume, she was intending to ride. I returned her greeting, and we fell into step. I apologize for any disturbance my presence may have caused. A shrug. You can't disturb a tomb. It was quiet here. I liked that, but it was not an appealing life for a girl her age. Is it just you and your grandmother? Yes, I stayed on with her as her companion when my grandfather died. She looked at the sky. Do you think it will rain? It was cloudy, but it did not feel like rain, and I said so. Good, I dislike riding in the rain. She fiddled with her gloves. The edges were neatly ornamented with black work. Was she the embroiderer? My mother has married again. Did Grandmère tell you? Talking to her was like playing tennis. I'm surprised you do not live with them. Grandmère needs me. Her pointed chin challenged me to disagree. With Uncle Walter gone, I'm all she has left. I remained silent, thinking of what Lady Margaret had told me about her daughter-in-law's new husband, a minor French nobleman who had spent much of his time at court, begging for scraps of royal attention. And they want to marry me off. That is what parents do. It was surprising that a match hadn't already been arranged. Did yours? The path split. The stables were to the left, and to the right the path curved around the back of the house toward a walled garden. I turned toward it. I didn't have parents. She frowned at me comically. Everyone has parents. A scrolled iron gate led us into the garden. As we walked, I sketched my origins. Wardlow, Hawley, Hatton. I've been threatening to join a convent, she said. Do you think they'll accept me? Do you have a vocation? I tried to imagine Marjorie Preston taking the veil. Stranger things had happened. Women ended up in convents for reasons above and beyond a love of God. Of course not, she said, kicking at the gravel path. But it would be a lot easier to fake that than enthusiasm for Jean Regard's choice of a husband. You should see the men he's paraded in front of me. Ah. She had been her grandparents' darling for so long, she wasn't likely to accept her mother's husband's choice. Her husband's mother. She had been her grandparents' darling for so long, she wasn't likely to accept her mother's husband in control of her future. I'm not sure a convent would welcome you without a vocation. Grandmère will give me a dowry, she said, and I'd rather marry God than some fat old man who only wants a broodmare. I ignored her language, even though I agreed, with the sentiment behind it, remembering Dorcas and her brewer. Do you want to be a nun? Her eyes glinted. What I want is to be left in peace. That's not going to happen. No one who wanted peace ever had it for long. I had learned that lesson over and over in my life. Marjorie ran her fingertips over the flowers, dusting her gloves with the drying stalks. Then it's the nunnery. You'll have to profess vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Obedience is the only hard one. Even during our few interactions, I had been struck by her forthright manner. This was not a girl who would take easily to the bridle. "You will have to give it to someone," I said, "whether it's to God or your husband." "Why? I'm happy with Grandmere. I don't want to marry anyone, especially if it benefits my stepfather." Perhaps Lady Margaret could find a more suitable match? She had been 20 years in France and had family here besides. Surely she could find someone her granddaughter could tolerate. "I don't want a more acceptable match." She crossed her arms. "I don't want a match at all." Marriage is a fact of life. You aren't married. I'm a man. I admired the view of the house from this angle. The garden had been laid out to take advantage of every view. It's not the same. "Why did you want my grandfather's house then? He assumed you had a family." "I remember he was surprised to find you intended to live there alone." Marjorie asked very probing questions. "I've never had a home before." I gave her the look that cowed my underlings in Cromwell's offices and occasionally Seb. It did not seem to bother her at all. "Hasn't your grandmother ever told you it's rude to ask questions?" "Yes, but I didn't listen." "I can see that." I tried to conceal my amusement. "Wait." She stopped and was still for so long that I turned around to see what was wrong. "Master Lewis." "What is it?" She looked like she'd been struck by lightning. "I think you should marry me." "What?" Perhaps I was the one struck by lightning. "You should marry me," Marjorie repeated with growing conviction. "I'm an heiress. You could own the house you've been living in all these years. It would solve both our problems." And there we have it. That's how our happy couple gets together. There's a bit more after this in A Wider World, but I'm going to leave that there. And we will go to Lady in Waiting, which starts almost immediately after. Robin leaves for England right after the wedding, and Marjorie and her grandmother follow within a week. So, here we go with the beginning of Lady in Waiting. This is November 1558. Chapter 1. If my father hadn't lost his head, my life would be very different. In point of fact, he did not lose his head. It was severed from his body with 3 strokes of an axe. I should know. I was there. One day I was a happy child, the center of a loving family, and the next my father was dragged from the house, accused of treason, and executed. My family left England, and I grew to womanhood far from home. With such uncertain beginnings, a young woman might find herself capable of anything. She might wish to escape her situation so badly that she proposes marriage to a man she's just met, thinking it will give her some measure of control over her life. Less than a week after our wedding, my husband left for England. My grandmother and I followed on the next ship. We had been out of England 18 years, during which time Winterset had become Robin Lewis's home. It was one of the reasons I married him. When he first appeared at our isolated home in Normandy, I resented his presence, but I quickly realized he was a solution, not another problem. He was more acceptable than the men put forward by my mother and her husband, and if I married him, my grandmother could return to her beloved estate. Tall and bony, with red hair gone thin in the back and a decided way about him, Robin was not my dream husband, but then I'd never dreamed of marriage. I knew only the sort of man I did not want, and if Mamma had her way, those men would soon be lining up in the lane, eager to claim my inheritance. Family money aside, most men wouldn't consider me a prize. While I was young and looked well enough, I had been raised away from society, and my manners showed it. I read books that young ladies did not read. My opinions were strong, and I had been known to raise my voice in company and interrupt my betters. Such behavior was not cherished by my mother, and my stepfather found me troublesome in the extreme. He tried various methods to break my will, and I ran away to my grandparents after one incident, having forced a stable lad to swap clothes so I could travel unnoticed. After close questioning, my grandfather declined to return me to their care. With my grandfather, I could live as I pleased, within reason. After his death, Grandmère deflected my mother's marital plans until I made one of my own. Then she fell in with my scheme, deeming it no worse than theirs, and possibly, when she realized we would return to England, far better. pausing for a wine break. Robin was the one who balked. He claimed to be too old and set in his ways, and that I would not be happy. I bribed him with Winterset and a promise not to disturb the peaceful life he'd built there. I was an heiress, I blithely assured him, and could make a new marriage when he died of old age. But I didn't want that. I didn't know Robin well. He did not allow himself to be easily known, but I liked him. In time, I thought we could learn to care for each other. When the coach stopped, Grandmere peered through the window, a gloved hand at her throat. "Do you remember any of it, Marjorie?" I remembered the tall limestone gate through which we had just passed, the gate where I had been playing the day my father was taken. "I think so. A bit." She sounded doubtful. The cart with our belongings stopped behind us, and Leon climbed down, glancing around the empty courtyard. "Should I knock, madame?" Before he could raise the knocker, the round-top door swung open, and a young maidservant appeared. Her mouth fell open when Grandmere informed her we had come to stay, but she ushered us inside, seating us at the hall table and bringing cups of ale. "The master is away from home." She twisted her apron in reddened hands. "I will send a boy for Fowler. He'll know what is to be done." Grandmere inspected the pewter cup. "For quality or cleanliness?" "Fowler is still here?" "He's been here since before I was born, milady." "Fowler was my husband's steward," she said. "This was my house." She sat with a cushion at her back while I paced the floor. The fire thawed the chill from my flesh, but did nothing for the icy sliver of worry in my heart. Why was Robin not here to welcome us? Nearly an hour passed before Fowler burst into the hall, tearing off his cap at the sight of my grandmother. "Welcome back, my lady." "Thank you, Fowler. It's good to be home." She put a hand on my shoulder. "Do you not recognize my granddaughter?" A hasty bow in my direction. "Little Mistress Marjorie, welcome." The girl said Master Lewis is away. Grandmere was never one to hide her displeasure. "When will he return?" Fowler's face, weathered by decades of outdoor work, grew pale at her question. "I'm not certain," he muttered. "He was called to London." I'd never been to London. Couldn't he have waited a few more days? "Well, that is a shame. He promised to be here." She glanced at me. "Stop fidgeting, child." He rocked on his heels. As I said, it was unexpected. I looked around and saw little evidence my husband had ever been here. "How long has he been gone?" 9 days. We hope to hear something soon." "I would hope so," Grandmere said crisply. "I have come all this way to deliver his bride." Fowler choked. "Master Lewis has taken a wife?" "He has." I nearly curtsied, remembering just in time that he was a servant. "Little Mistress Marjorie is now Mistress Lewis." As Leon and the Winterset servants emptied the cart, the hall filled with our things. Chests of clothes, small furnishings, crates of silver and pewter plate, wall hangings, the great bed Grandmere brought from Winterset to France and back again. When we found our possessions in her old room and not one of the smaller chambers, the maid explained simply, "The master sleeps in the corner chamber. They say he likes to hear the sea." "He will soon change," Grandmere told her. "That chamber is too small for a married couple, but it will suit me well enough." While she rested, I explored the rest of the house and found it surprisingly familiar. Wandering its rooms, I recalled the carved overmantel in the hall and the triple mullioned windows in the room which had been my grandfather's office, and which was now Robin's library. I lingered there, trying to get a sense of my husband from his books. There were volumes in English, French, German, and Latin. Histories and religious texts abounded, but there was also philosophy, literature, and even some verse. My fingers hovered over a slim book of Wyatt's poems, but it was not my place to borrow his books without asking. Much was the same, and yet much was different, because when we left, the furnishings went with us, and Grandmere had returned with only the best pieces, on the assumption that Robin had furnished the house. He had, but it was an odd assortment. A few carved chests, an exceptional convex mirror in the hall, some painted wall hangings. Most of the furniture was plain, serviceable stuff. It apparently suited him, but my grandmother's disappointment was palpable. "Will you send for more of your things?" "It would cost too much," she said, "but I did think, as an officer of the court, that Master Lewis would have more refined taste." Robin hadn't been an officer of the court when he took the house, and he didn't strike me as the sort who cared about his surroundings, so long as his basic needs were met. I peeked into his bedchamber, remembering it as the room where I'd slept between my parents. The maid was right. The murmur of the sea was audible through the closed shutters. I sat on the edge of the green curtain bed and imagined my possessions fitted in with his, and smiled. I would not mind starting my married life in this room. And that is the end of Chapter 1. If you were good readers and pre-ordered like I asked, begged, pleaded, your book will arrive on your device at midnight tonight. Try not to stay up too late, but if you do, let me know. I asked for questions in advance, so you won't have to see me squinting to read them on the phone. If you have one now, please leave it in the comments and I'll be happy to answer it later. I did get a few, though, so you can indulge me by listening. From Diane, is Marjorie's attitude toward marriage typical of a woman of the time? In a sense it is. She's not looking for a love match, and most women weren't. Marriage was a business arrangement, generally between families. Certainly, the young woman involved was rarely asked, and if there ended up being love between the couple, it happened later. So she is looking at Robin in a very practical way. He will suit her purposes. She will not disturb his life. It serves the long game she has, which is to bring herself and her grandmother back home. And she hopes for the best. She knows he's a nice man, and she thinks that's probably the best option of what she's been offered. From Lori, how does Robin's relationship with Marjorie differ from his relationship with Bianca from A Wider World? Bianca, if you haven't read A Wider World, Bianca was an older woman, Italian. Robin met her when he was very young, and he would not have called her his mistress. He would have said that they were lovers. They were very close, but the age difference was as significant there as it is now between Robin and Marjorie. I think they cared very much about each other, the same as Robin and Marjorie will come to, but his relationship with Bianca was always very separate. There was no chance of them marrying. There was no chance of them building a life together. They had things in common, but they had very separate lives. Robin and Marjorie will learn to build something that is very day-to-day in the present, so they have a chance, if they can manage it, to build something very different. From Marion, would Robin and or Marjorie have a code of silence when it came to talking about the royals? Between themselves, but not to anyone else? Once Robin gets back, they will be traveling to London, because Robin will be working for Queen Elizabeth as an undersecretary, and Marjorie will be a minor lady in waiting. Both of them are required to sign an oath of loyalty and basically a confidentiality agreement, and that extends to not talking to their spouse, even if their spouse belongs to the court as well. As Marjorie is told early on, your husband works for the chief secretary and you work for the queen. She didn't realize there was a difference. At some point they will begin to compare notes, but in the beginning Marjorie does try to keep her confident. She does try to stay loyal to the queen, and it does not bode well for a marriage when you're more loyal to your boss than to your spouse. Jennifer wants to know, I'm interested in how you decided which incidental character to focus on in the later books. What was it about them that grabbed you? Also, how did the process of writing the first book inform how you approach the others, particularly since the first one evolved over years and the others flowed more quickly? Yeah, Songbird was probably 20 plus years in the making. And the other ones, I think, writing is like any other muscle. I think once you realize that once you start writing, the ideas are going to keep coming. I didn't really think I had a book besides Songbird. But when I finished it, I started working on something else, and then I started thinking about Robin, who was a character I didn't even like all that much when I wrote Songbird. He is morally gray and more than a little prickly, but he's come to be my favorite character of anybody I've ever come up with. So he flowed not necessarily naturally from Songbird, but he showed up and didn't shut up, so I had to write his story. Marjorie only was supposed to appear as the child of the Preston family, but when I was writing the end of the book and I had him stop by the house to visit her grandmother, all of a sudden she showed up, and she had such a large personality that when she asked him to marry her, I wasn't completely surprised, and I couldn't wait to get to the third book to start telling her story. And Nancy, I've seen you talk about a book set in the 1930s. Is this the end of the Tudors? This is not the end of the Tudors. It is the end of the Tudors for right now, because the fourth book, which I do have in mind, extends later into Elizabeth I's reign and has something to do with Mary Queen of Scots as well, and that one's going to take a fair bit more research than I have accomplished at this point. The 1930s book is done, and I've sent out a few advance copies. That will be out in October, and that was a completely different thing to write for me. I would have thought that a more recent time period would have been easier, and it wasn't. But I will, talk about that more close to time. I don't want to completely derail the time period that I'm supposed to be talking about right now. So I guess that is it for now. Thank you all for showing up. I hope you've enjoyed this glimpse into book 3. Remember, reviews are important, especially for indie authors, so leave one on Amazon or Goodreads or whatever your favorite retailer is. Just as good, tell a friend, share one of my posts on social media. Word of mouth is how independent authors find new readers, and new readers is the best way to keep this independent author out of a cubicle, which is, at this point, my life goal. Cheers, everyone. I'll see you next time.